Coming up on This Week in Computer Hardware, hands-on with Corsair's Hydro X series custom liquid cooling. Let's talk about SSD warranties. The Sapphire Pulse Radeon RX 5700 XT gets benchmarked. Sega Genesis Mini. How about 42 games, people? All that and more coming up next on Twitch.
Netcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is Twitch.
This is Twitch, This Week in Computer Hardware, episode 529, recorded on August 15th, 2019. The reversing PSU fan sucks. This episode of This Week in Computer Hardware is brought to you by Mint Mobile. They provide the same premium network coverage you're used to, but at a fraction of the cost because everything is online. Mint Mobile makes it easy to cut your wireless bill down to just $15 a month with their 3-month introductory plan. And get the plan shipped to your door for free at mintmobile.com/twitch. Welcome to Twitch, This Week in Computer Hardware, Twitch weekly show that aims to bring you the most engaging, most delightful, most affordable, most complicated, most simple, most something. We just want to be an excellent source of PC, mobile, console, desktop, laptop, cell phone, news, and reviews. If you hear the dulcet tones of... we try to cover the gamut. Sebastian Peak is the voice you're hearing if you're watching the video, and it's the voice you're hearing if you're listening to the audio. Beautiful.
True. Yes. Audio is the same on video and audio, I've noticed. The podcast sounds the same as the video version, believe it or not.
For those of you who are watching and are displeased with the saturation of the colors, the color tone of my video, I have actually completely blown out all of the settings on this camera. I will try a second Sony a6000. I'd like to point out that it's not the sensor or the camera I'm using, because it is oddly enough, the exact same camera and sensor that is being used by Sebastian Peak, and practically the same lens. Well, okay, and I have actually swapped out the same lens.
Patrick, it's not possible for this camera to be in two places at the same time.
You have a point, sir.
They're different cameras, but it's the same model.
Not just a hardware benchmarker, but a metaphysician too.
True. Yes. And possibly a time traveler.
It's a 24 megapixel Sony A series sensor. I assure you, it is not the camera. And we've tried a whole bunch of settings. And if I could show you a clip of what the video looks like after it's run through Skype and the switcher versus what's coming out of my camera, you would be shocked and amazed, because they are radically different. And I realize other hosts have different results. It's because they're using radically different cameras and radically different lighting environments. So that's all I'm going to say about videography and the conditions of the room I'm shooting in. We should probably talk about hardware, because technically this is This Week in Computer Hardware. And while camera sensors are definitely hardware, we should talk about some of the excitement that's going on with you. Last week, behind Sebastian, you caught a sneak peek of the delightfully colorful build he did, or you did, with Corsair's Hydro X series custom cooling. That was announced at CES, and is essentially Corsair has an all-in-one website where you can pick all of the things, all of the widgets, all of the tubing and plumbing and tanks, and it's just you forget, if you haven't done liquid cooling, custom liquid cooling, right? Because the last few years it's all been about closed systems where you get a box, and inside the box is a pump / heat sink with tubing attached to a radiator. You're looking at like a cold plate, a fluid chamber, and then a whole bunch of tubing and couplings. How did you enjoy the process of speccing this out and building? Did you miss anything when you specced it out the first time and have to order more parts? Because a big thing about this is that they have this fairly sophisticated website, we talked about it before, that walks you through, I have this processor and I have this GPU and I want to connect this and this and this to the liquid cooling system.
Yeah, and it goes a little bit more than that, because they also ask you what case you have, exactly what motherboard you have, and try to figure out what you can fit in your case. And for me, I went through all of this, and I didn't really provide a case because I was working with Corsair on this actually before it was officially launched. Mm-hmm. And while I had this stuff in-house during the month of Ricember, as I called it, the end of June into the beginning of July, when I was doing nothing but CPU testing, I had to put it on the back burner until that was all over. But then I realized I was kind of was procrastinating because I've never done custom liquid cooling before, and it was intimidating. And it's not for the faint of heart. Although I will say, like, as I was going through everything and making sure I like laid it all out and did some rough measurements and figured out what the length of tubing I'd need, and it became a lot easier because of just the realization hitting, like, I'm doing all of this dry. Like, you don't add any liquid to the loop until you're completely done building the loop and everything is nicely connected and you've double checked all of your seals. There's still a little bit of fear because I just went for it and threw it on my rare and, impossible to find Ryzen 9 3900X, and grabbed, of course, the most expensive GPU I have here, which is a RTX 2080 Ti Founders Edition. I said, hey, what the heck? I'll rip the stock cooler off of this GPU and slap a water block on it. And never done this before. It was very easy, though. And I will say, once I figured out how to get the Founders Edition cooler off, which it turns out is a simple matter of just taking the back plate off, removing some screws on the back I/O panel, and then pulling. I was attempting to disassemble the entire thing at once, which was a mistake. But once you get through, the setup and the planning stage, and like you mentioned, like making sure you have all the right fittings and stuff. And I only asked for flexible tubing. I did not want to, as my first attempt ever, also have to deal with rigid tubing. So just flexible stuff, which left me some room for error, along with the fact that I was using some different types of adapters, one of which was like a 45-degree angle adapter that was, you could rotate 360 degrees, so I had a little bit of extra reach when I needed it. But just to kind of briefly go over what the parts are, they provide a single pump and reservoir combo no matter what you do as far as speccing out your system. There's only one. They don't have a separate reservoir or a separate pump. So that's it. Like, then there's different radiators. There's two different thicknesses of radiators they offer, and thicker radiators are generally better. I know fin density matters a lot. We could go into fin density versus radiator thickness and like the pressure from your fans, and then push versus pull, and then push pull, and all that other stuff. Some of the same stuff that we've talked about with liquid coolers that were all-in-one closed loop coolers for the last decade or so. And of course, Corsair has been at the forefront of those. Like the H100 was kind of what brought those to the forefront. As I know, it's been almost a decade, I think, since the H100 was really kind of changing how people viewed liquid cooling, and it was far more effective than a lot of the air coolers of that time, because this was in an era before the giant, just ridiculously efficient, ultra quiet coolers like the Noctua NHD 14s of the world were out there, and the Silver Arrow, I think, from Thermalright. And of course, now we have giant, like, Be Quiet coolers like the Dark Rock Pro 4, very similar to like a Noctua D15, which is the current one, I believe, or is there a D16 by now? But
let's pause for a second, right? Because a classic at this point, and we'll talk about it more in a couple minutes, like, $35, you get a Cooler Master Hyper 212 or Hyper 212 Evo CPU cooler. It's an air cooler. It's not particularly huge. Uses copper heat pipes. It's got sort of a copper, if memory serves, it's copper and aluminum on the base plate. It may just be less, just aluminum.
It's copper because it's those direct contact pipes. There's 4 pipes, and they just directly contact the CPU.
If you're not overclocking at the far end of the extreme of, some sort of 140 watt CPU, it probably has enough thermal capacity to do whatever you want it to do. Fan might get a little loud, but the fan doesn't get particularly loud. It's amazing how much cooling you get for $35. When you were looking at this system, were you thinking, gosh, I'm going to have this amazing, because I feel like this choice was more for aesthetics than it was for sort of real world performance. And it's kind of probably going to irritate Corsair me saying that, but I like liquid coolers. I have liquid coolers on anything I plan on overclocking the snot out of. I tend to put a closed loop liquid cooler on it, just because I like having more thermal capacity than I can use. But if you're not overclocking, this is almost entirely an aesthetic choice.
I will say yes, with the one condition that with GPUs, that's not the case.
Okay.
With a CPU, you're absolutely right. You can get a cooler like the Hyper 212 Evo, which, even though it's not a loud cooler, it is around 44, 45 dB if you really push it, if the fan is going close to 100%. But with closed loop coolers, when you're comparing those to larger air coolers, there's less of an argument. It becomes far less compelling because at some point you just run out of fluid in the loop. And if you are really, really pushing a CPU and you're getting close to that TJ Max temperature where it's actually going to start throttling the CPU under extreme load, then at some point the liquid in that loop becomes hot enough that it's no longer effective at cooling the CPU. Just like at some point you run out of space like to put the heat on your heatsink. At some point the pipes have just reached a certain temperature.
They've been saturated.
There's nowhere else for it to go. So the idea there, if that's what the limit you're hitting, then building a large loop where you have a lot of tubing and a reservoir and multiple radiators, there's a lot more liquid. And so the overall temperature of the liquid takes a lot longer to get to that point of no return. So there's one advantage. If you were just pushing your system 100% 24/7, you would run into that thermal limit a lot later, if ever, with a custom system than you would with, conventional options. But the CPU temperatures that I saw from this, while considerably lower, and I was only looking at it versus my initial findings with this R9 3900X with the stock cooler, the Wraith Prism that it shipped with, which obviously is not what any enthusiast is going to do if they're even potentially going to be overclocking this thing. And I hadn't done any overclocking testing yet, but it went from 89 degrees under load, which is high, to about 75. So it was like 74.
That's a big jump. That's a huge delta.
It's a big jump. And I would expect a similar jump if I were to go to a very large air cooler as well. Maybe not quite that much, and I've got to do that testing still. But the huge, huge difference was with the GPU. And imagine, like, if you're thinking about it, the CPU has its own heat spreader on it. And there's some sort of internal compound, whether it's silver solder or some sort of thermal paste between the heat spreader that you actually see and the die that's down beneath. And there's different schools of thoughts about this, and people have absolutely delidded their CPUs to take that heat spreader off, put their own thermal compound on, or actually just put the heatsink directly up against the die, which is dangerous because you always risk cracking the die. So, be that as it may, a GPU, when I took the stock cooler off of this RTX 2080 Ti, that's a bare GPU die. And when you put a water block on your bare GPU die, you are exposing it to the absolute best thermals you can probably ever get out of that PCB and that GPU. And that's where the huge, huge difference was, where under load before removing the stock cooler on an open test bench like this one, in about a 25 degree room Celsius, I was getting between 75 and 77 C under load. And that's with the fans ramping up nicely. And it was staying under 80, which is fine. It was never throttling, but you start to hear the fans, and high 70s for a very high performance GPU like that is great, but you put that inside of a case, you don't have the best airflow, it's going to be a lot higher than that because, again, open test bench. I put the GPU block on it, ran it in this system. My loads went down to 47 to 48 C with the same benchmarks in the same room. So we're talking 30 degrees cooler with the same GPU. And it's just remarkable. Like the amount of headroom you gain from water cooling your GPU, like putting a full block on it where your VRMs, the memory, and the GPU itself are all being water cooled and direct contact like that. It's just phenomenal, the difference. So, I didn't produce the most impressive loop ever. It was a very simple loop. I could have added a second radiator to it, although I wasn't overclocking, so there was no real need for that. My system is what Corsair would consider a level 1. They do 3 different levels. Level 2 would be like your quiet, but with overclocking capabilities, like where they had a second radiator, and then you can go crazy with multiple radiators and push-pull fans and go as nuts as you want to go. But with just a single 360 rad and 328 millimeter fans, I mean, 48 degrees underload from the GPU was just nuts. It blew my mind. And it looks amazing because it's like you said, it's as much about aesthetics really as performance, but with GPU, it's not even close. And I have recently, we talked about that EVGA. It was a 2080 Super, but it was their Hydro edition where it has an all-in-one 120 millimeter closed loop connected to the GPU. And then because it's a hybrid, it has a fan that still cools the VRMs and the memory, but the difference is night and day. It's even with an all-in-one connected to the GPU like that, going underwater completely takes it to another level. However, the loop that I put together cost as much as a 2080 Super. So I mean, you're looking at around $600 to $700 to put together what I did, if you buy all the parts from scratch.
And we should point out, I think you said it was like around, it was like $617 was the configuration you put together on their website, and you compared that to if you pulled together an EK loop, that priced out between $710 and $780 depending on where you put it. So this is competitive. It's a single source. They have the configurator to make your life easy. Mostly easiest, I should probably suggest, if you're using a Corsair case. Do they have non-Corsair case options on that?
Oh yeah.
Okay. Good. It
was surprising. Like they had Fantex stuff. One of the guys on our site last night was speccing one out for his Fantex case, and he said there was a bunch of different vendors on there. Not everything has a picture. Like you're not going to be able to visualize it the same way as you would with Corsair's stuff when you're looking at it, because their configurator. For audio listeners, the EK configurator, if you've ever visited their site, I think they were first with that. It's mostly like black text on a white page. You have a few diagrams, a few examples when you wrap it up and look at the total build costs and stuff. But Corsair's is one of those highly polished. Yeah, Corsair's is different. It's very polished. Looks like an app. It's like a web app running in your browser that has the ability to kind of go back and forth more easily and visualize what it is you've built so far and where the radiators are, and lets you go back and like change like the cooling level, or maybe change which fans you pick, because you can start off with just plain fans, or do single LED colored fans, or those really cool like addressable RGB fans where each fan has, I think, 8 different lights in it that can individually be changed.
Well, I mean, it was kind of nuts. I think you have $130 in RGB fans in this, or maybe $150 in RGB fans in this.
Yeah.
So that adds it adds up. And I also say, as somebody who spent like $180 on a water block for a CPU, 15 years ago, these prices are not bad. This is not something, this is not something that's going to scale the same way, an entry-level CPU cooler is going. You gave this the gold award, if memory serves. Did you? I mean, now that you've done it once, do you feel calm and comfortable about this, or do you think you would be just as nervous going into a build like this in the future, putting water inside of your expensive computer?
I would have no qualms doing it again. The only thing that bugs me is taking it all apart, draining it, and safely disconnecting everything and making sure you don't spill any water on anything. Because, like I said, you build it all dry, you make sure all the connections are tight, and then you fill it and kind of pray. And there's paper towel galore covering everything where there might be drips, and like looking. And the first night, I couldn't go to sleep that night because I'd started the loop running, and then I kept running back and checking all my paper towels, making sure there weren't any drips. And finally I just I guess I can trust this until the morning. And it takes a long time to get the bubbles out. I mean, there's different techniques to get bubbles out, and I got almost all of them out, but there was still some micro bubbles in the reservoir even when I was doing my testing.
They will bother you forever.
Yes. They don't look as nice as I'd like them to look in photos, but I dealt with it. I kept waiting and waiting. Like, I'm not going to take a picture of the res until all those bubbles are gone. Then I just gave in.
Pro tip, if you do get water on a motherboard, which is terrifying, yank the power cable out of the power supply, and don't use a hair dryer to try to get the moisture out of there. Use a vacuum instead, but only one with plastic fittings on the end, because sometimes if you use a blow dryer, it can force water underneath components in a place that they will be enormously difficult to dry. But most of the time, shutting the machine off and letting it sit for 24 hours will let everything dry inside of there. If you decide to put it into an oven to dry it, which I'm not too stoked about, but I know people who have done it, be real careful about how high you turn the temperatures up. Because nothing says uh-oh like wiping out the family stove with a terrible motherboard burning incident.
Yeah.
Because if you have the kind of family where they walk up to the stove and, it must be warming something, and turn it up to 450 to bake something, it's going to get nasty. It's just so horrifying to think about. While we're talking about cooling, Tails the Fox emailed Twitch at twitch.tv, thermoelectric cooling, 2 words. And I was laughing because I pulled up the Wikipedia entry to show for this one just out of personal amusement. Thermoelectric coolers, Peltier coolers, they use the Peltier effect, which is essentially you take 2 dissimilar metals, you run electrons through them, i.e. you run voltage through them, and it creates a heat pump. One side gets cold, one side gets hot. Hence, you put the side that gets cold is the part you attach to the CPU. These were a big thing a long-ass time ago, I want to say in the 90s. And it's pretty slick. You could get like a 60, 70 degree delta between the 2 sides, but condensation was often a really big issue, as in enough water would be generated to drip down onto the motherboard and short things out. So you had to be really careful how these were deployed. And they really got buried by the performance improvements made in closed liquid coolers and the rather epic dollar for cooling capacity improvements that were made in air coolers. They still exist. Like if you go up on Newegg or Amazon and search for thermoelectric cooler, you'll get like a big giant page, and most of them will be little sort of squares of material with red and black wires running out of them. Hence, you connect those to a power source, and they're mostly for industrial applications. I was kind of fascinated to realize that around 2016, a new thermoelectric cooler for desktop PCs was introduced by, I want to say Phononic, which is such a weird word you say. Like every time I say it, I think I'm missing something, and I look back, at the web page or in this case, our spreadsheet, and the Phononic Hex 2.0 integrated 92 millimeter CPU cooler, which is a healthy $120 on Newegg, which puts it right smack in the middle of the cost of many of Corsair and their competitors in terms of closed loop liquid coolers. And Tweaktown did a review, and Antec did a review. They perform as well as large air coolers. Tweaktown was a little more enthusiastic about it because they were like, you can get big air cooler performance out of a much smaller package. And Antec's approach was like, this is really good as a substitute for an air cooler, but it doesn't have the thermal capacity we want to see for overclocking. But I was looking at it, it's like $120. It's slick. It does require a fair amount of power. And that's where a lot of people get frustrated with thermoelectric or Peltier cooling, is the fact that you have to run a fair amount of wattage into that device. There's an example right there. DC voltage source. And it's like, negative electrons flow through and pull the heat from one end to the other. I'll be honest with you, I'm sticking to my cheap, high-performing air coolers with occasional bursts of liquid cooling for when I get kind of unhinged with overclocking. And, if I get a 3950X, I'll probably be going into the garage and pulling the full-on radiator out just to see if I can maximize the liquid cooling on that. We mentioned it before, Cooler Master Hyper 212 Evo, $35, more than enough capacity for the vast majority of devices out there. I think between the two of us, we probably experimented with several dozen air and liquid coolers. But the truth is, if you're not overclocking, an air cooler is going to take care of you. If you are overclocking, that's when you need to start paying attention to cooling, unless you're going for aesthetics, in which case spend all the money and take a look at Corsair's Hydro X series, unless you want to get really insane and build out a system yourself. I can almost hear Sebastian shuddering in Michigan right now.
Yeah, it's not for the faint of heart. That's why I sort of tempered my enthusiasm for it, because it's like, well, we work in an industry where companies are willing to supply samples to be reviewed. I would not have gone out and spent this amount of money on liquid cooling, but just to look at this and see how easy it was for a first timer to build it, see what kind of performance I could get, and sort of marveling at the aesthetics of it, because every single component in the chain has addressable RGBs that all go into this controller, and you tell the software what order it all is. You can create these effects where one cascades into the next, or it's remarkable the amount of control you have over the lighting. I just stuck with rainbow-like effects for all of my photos, but it's expensive. I mean, there's no getting around that. And it's, even if it was $1, it still would not be for everybody, because setting it up requires a lot of planning, patience, double checking connections, and it's very intimidating for the first timer, as I can attest.
You got through it. You jumped. You lived. Your computer didn't die. This is a positive thing on all three counts.
Yes.
Oh my goodness. Sapphire Pulse Radeon RX 5700 XT, which just rolls right off the tongue. You got that in for benchmarking. What were your thoughts on this latest 5700 XT?
Well, it's
cool,
the very
and quiet.
Beginning. Yeah, I mean, this August 12 was the beginning of the add-in board partner launch. I think that was the first day. So this was an early card that was sent out a couple days in advance to press, and we were one of the outlets that got a chance to look at it. And it's kind of your average aftermarket dual fan card. I mean, this is the Pulse series is kind of their budget-minded series. And then Sapphire has Nitro cards for their higher performance, a little bit better cooling, higher overclocks out of the box. This has a slight factory overclock. The review ended up being, well, absolutely, it was a showcase for what you can do with a much better cooler with these RX 5700 series cards. And they released this in a 5700 and a 5700 XT. It became almost all about low noise compared to AMD's reference cooler, because at least in my case, the performance of this aftermarket cooler or aftermarket card was actually slightly lower than my reference card. And after doing a whole bunch of extra testing way into the middle of the night before the launch, when I discovered this, when I was making my charts, I realized that my press sample of the 5700 XT with the reference design, the blower cooler, is clocked a little bit high. So
really,
I have a permanent overclock baked into that card that I wasn't aware of, because that was the only card I'd ever had. And you have to monitor frequencies and actually look. And even though Sapphire was putting about a 65 or 70 megahertz overclock on this, because AMD's actual stock card, they have 3 different clocks, and there's actually a 4th clock just to make it extra easy to comprehend. There's the base clock, which is not actually the base clock. It's the clock that if you back the GPU into a corner with fur mark or something, it's the lowest boost speed, basically. And that's 1605 megahertz on the reference card, I believe. Or at least that's what they claim. And then the game clock should be about 1750. And then the peak clock should be somewhere around 2100 megahertz, if it can hit that. And that's like short bursts. Looking at GPU-Z with both of these cards, the reference card and the Sapphire card, I was seeing that the Sapphire card was actually idling at 1419 megahertz, which looking at the reference BIOS, that should be 1400. So it's slightly higher. Okay, it's a slightly overclocked card. But my press sample was running at 1439. And that slight advantage was consistent across the board. It was like 20 or 30 megahertz higher than the Sapphire card at all loads. So I did some quick comparison testing, running a looped benchmark and observing and then charting the frequencies that I was seeing, and it was peaking higher, it was averaging higher by about that 30 or 40 megahertz actually. So not the best review when it comes to actually looking at what the Sapphire is capable of versus a true reference design, rather than my overperforming card. But it was still very impressive to hear a card that under full load was more than 10 dB lower than the reference card. And it was cooler at the same time. And if you bumped up the clocks, like what Gamers Nexus has done, because they do this, we were talking before the show, I think it was before the show, their Gamers Nexus is very popular on YouTube with hardware reviews. Yes. And definitely check out their review because they have the same card. They do what's called normalized testing, where they have picked 40 decibels as the number, and they adjust the fan percentage until they hit 40 decibels of noise from, I think it's 20 inches away with their sound meter on an open test bench. And then they do their thermal testing. So with AMD's reference card, they were targeting around 48 dB, I believe. It's actually kind of capped. Once it reaches like 48 point something dB, then the clock speeds actually start to drop, and it will throttle as needed to maintain that volume output, because they were concerned about using a blower design and having it get really, really loud.
Right.
But if you normalize that down to 40 dB, then you are reducing the cooling efficiency. And then if you increase this Sapphire card, which for me under load was like 38.3 dB, you're giving it a boost. If you put it at 40 dB, you're actually increasing the clock speed from the factory defaults. So Gamers Nexus, for their testing, they show a huge disparity between the two cards, because they're putting the reference card in a bad position because it's spinning a lot slower. And for a blower design, that's death. And then with this Pulse card, they're actually increasing the clock speeds, so they're enhancing its performance. The numbers that I got were still a couple of degrees cooler for both the edge temp and the hot spot, like the hottest point. They have a bunch of different sensors in this new Navi GPU core. So the very hottest temperature was still a couple of degrees lower, even at only 38 decibels under full load. So if you are okay with 40 dB and want to simulate what Gamers Nexus did, you're going to get even better thermals than that. So it's great to see an add-in board partner and see what a vastly better cooler can do. And if you're watching the video, you're seeing Gamers Nexus, their thermal results with that 40 decibel normalized testing I brought up. And we're talking GPU junction temps from 109.6 with the reference card. That's the hotspot temperature under extended load, with the cooler running slow to hit the 40 dB, still at 109.6. And that's where it started throttling, actually, because 110 degrees or thereabouts is where they start to throttle. And of course, after this goes up, then AMD ended up responding, and they basically said 110 is the safe limit for these cards, which is pretty impressive that they're confident it'll run safely at 110. This is 7 nanometer, kind of new territory for silicon, but they're happy with 110 apparently. But you don't have to settle for that, and there's going to be a lot of other partner designs we're going to see. I know a couple of places posted a review of the Asus Strix card a little bit early, apparently. I haven't seen the US outlets with that review yet. And then there's, I'm sure, a bunch of other designs that are coming down the pike, but it's, I mean, as great as the RX 5700 series has been in our testing and around the web, it's really close. The XT especially is really close to the performance of a Radeon 7, like within 5 or 6% sometimes for a card that's $400. It's really the only thing that was holding it back, and I think some people were kind of on the fence about making the purchase, was just that blower design. I've heard so many negative comments, so much feedback about a blower style cooler in 2019. Like, people just not really interested in that anymore. They don't want the 48, 50 dB under load. And I get it. And clearly, as we're seeing, even with this more budget-minded card from Sapphire, you can get better thermals and lower noise with just a better cooler design. And one last thing before I forget, because this is something that's exclusive to Sapphire, forget the cooler design. Their software application, which I typically ignore the vendor specific software applications because I like MSI Afterburner, and there's some standards out there for NVIDIA cards. I always use EVGA's Precision X1.
Sure.
But the Trix, that's TRIXX, is the name of Sapphire's utility. And apparently in the past, it's been a rather loud visually, this utility, but they've toned it way down. It kind of looks like Windows 10 settings window now. Very flat design. But a very interesting feature is hidden in there. It's called Trix Boost, and it basically simulates and gives you total granular control over a DLSS-like effect, where you choose a lower rendering resolution for your game, and then you point your game at this new resolution you've created. In their example, or my example, because they had said, hey, check out what happens if you just lower the resolution by 10%. And then upscale it by that same 10%. It's going to have a huge performance boost without any overclocking, and you won't be able to tell a difference with your naked eye. Obviously screenshots will show the difference if you want to zoom in and point to the edge of something or point to a color like a texture. But if you are gaming on a 1440p monitor and you lower the internal resolution by 10%, so it ends up with an odd resolution that's like 1296 instead of 1440. You point your game at this new 1296p resolution and then let the upscaling take care of the difference. And in fact, if you're using one of the compatible APIs, which unfortunately is not DirectX 11, that was something that excited some comment when AMD had talked about their new image sharpening technology that's available for Navi cards, but it only works with DX9, DX12, and Vulkan, no DX11, which is, most games. So if you do have a DX12 or Vulkan title, enable this as well, and that will help with the quality of the upscaling. And I did this. I tested a couple different games in DirectX 12 mode, Metro Exodus and Shadow of the Tomb Raider. And I was seeing, in Shadow of the Tomb Raider, it went up by about 10 frames per second without touching anything else. And I was staring at the benchmark and trying to identify if anything looked lower resolution to me. I thought I was seeing something in some of the color information, but you really need to basically do some screenshots to see this. And I thought this was great. And this is something that is not an AMD feature. This is they do the image sharpening. So you could potentially, like, say you buy a shiny new 4K monitor and you don't have quite the GPU horsepower to game at 4K at the averages that you want. Maybe you can play a game at lower settings at 4K, but if you want to look at it with high graphical settings on a 5700 or 5700 XT, and you want those higher frame rates, then this would be a great way to do that. Because with Radeon image sharpening, you could set the game to a lower resolution. For example, set it to 2560 by 1440, and then have Radeon image sharpening assist the process of upscaling that to fill your 4K native display.
Right.
But that's a big gap, and the idea of maybe just a 10 or 12% disparity between the two, and having a slider to control that and look at the result until you're happy with it, knowing that with every percentage point you're gaining frames per second, it's really interesting. So I would love to see this as like a global setting, something that AMD takes a look at, says, hey, we'd like to offer this. Because you can go the opposite way. You can create virtual super resolutions that are much higher than what your monitor can even produce, and then subsequently have it downscale. And this was one of the ways that AMD was showing how you could even potentially come close to using the 16 gigabyte frame buffer of the Radeon 7, was basically game at 8K, but downscale it to 4K by the time it hits your monitor, with the obvious hit on performance that entails. I tried this myself with Shadow of the Tomb Raider, by the way, on high. And Shadow of the Tomb Raider at 8K, high preset, I think I was getting around 1.5 to 2 frames per second. So that was on a RTX 2080. Like, you know what? This is not a good idea. This is not a good idea. Do not do this.
This is not competitive.
No, do the opposite though. Rendering your game at a slightly lower resolution and then upscaling it looks pretty damn good. So kudos to Sapphire for coming up with this. And it did work. It worked as advertised. So If you buy a Sapphire card, that's the only way to do this right now.
Two quick hits before we thank our sponsor this week. If you've been thinking about buying a 3700X, as near as I can tell, AMD's not quite flagship third generation Ryzen processor is available at vastly inflated prices, or you can go to Micro Center, a physical Micro Center store. As near as I can tell, Newegg sold out. Amazon's been sold out for a while, so you're looking at paying $100 to $200 VIGs, and the 3900Xs are being sold all by third-party vendors for $600 plus, closing into $650, $700 on those. So if you've been thinking about buying a next-generation AMD system, either A, wait, or B, drive yourself to a Micro Center. Props to Micro Center for keeping those for their brick-and-mortar store fans. And I got to say, it's probably a smart choice on their part. But literally, if you're not them, you're paying a lot more for these parts anywhere else. Exciting news if you're into little tiny consoles. The NES Classic exploded into the universe a couple years ago, led to a flood of similar pint-sized reproductions of classic gaming consoles. The crew at The Verge has updates on the latest that's coming out, the Sega Genesis Mini. And this thing is pretty ninja. 55% smaller than the original, HDMI output, of course. 42 built-in games for a quite reasonable price, I think, of $80. So if you are a fan of, yes, ladies and gentlemen, brace for impact, Sonic the Hedgehog, Echo the Dolphin, Castlevania Bloodfight, Space Harrier 2, Shining Force, Dr. Robotnik's Mean Bean Machine, and then it just goes on and on. Altered Beast, Gunstar Heroes, Castle of Illusion starring Mickey Mouse, Shinobi 3, Vector Man, Wonder Boy and Monster. It just kind of goes on and on and on. Tetris, Darius, Light Crusader. So yeah, I think this is kind of a really good broad hit on all the different genres that were available on the platform. I also got to say, I love the fact that they used a micro USB input for the power on this, so you don't have to worry about losing a squirrely power supply that you can't replace. Yay.
Yeah. And I will say too about these mini consoles, because there's so many of them now. I mean, we've seen, I think there's even a mini TurboGrafx 16. There's obviously the Nintendo ones. We saw the PlayStation Mini, which was much maligned, but we don't have to talk about that.
PlayStation Classic.
Yeah, the idea though, if you look at the alternatives, obviously you can buy one of these compilation discs. I have the Genesis compilation for PlayStation that's really good, but there's something about, being on an original console, but when you actually look at the trouble involved, it's find one if you don't already have one, and that means like go to your local game shops and pay whatever their asking price is, or go on eBay and then deal with that experience. And then if you want any selection of games, you're doing the same thing. You're hunting for games on eBay or at local shops, and it's just the idea of taking something the size, take something the size of a paperback book, plug it into your TV with HDMI, so you're not digging around for adapters and things. Because let's face it, very few TVs have composite input without the use of some sort of adapter anymore. And
there's
really,
a few, but the list is short.
To me, the experience is just not the same unless you're on a CRT. And these were game systems that were designed for CRTs. They look a little weird on LCD TVs, and you have to deal with, when you can do the aspect ratio correction on most TVs, but it still looks a little funny because it's upscaling something that is often around
4x3, and you need black bars, and you need to just live with that, because if you're scaling Sonic the Hedgehog, no, because then you're either cutting off a big chunk of it, or you're making his face shape wrong, and either one of those are unacceptable. Except for embrace the 4x3, and on the Sega Genesis Mini, you'll be embracing it. I want to say September 19th is the launch date for that one. If it's like every other,
it's a legal way to own all these games that you may or may not have been playing as ROMs for the last couple of decades. So,
well, and if you don't have the ROMs, getting them has gotten harder and harder because the law has come down on many of the places that were hosting those, possibly to enable sales of more consoles reproducing the games. And if you're a fan of an obscure game, then you're just screwed, because it's going to get harder and harder to find those. This episode of This Week in Computer Hardware brought to you by Mint Mobile. Mint Mobile is an MVNO. What does that mean? They take cellular access, they purchase cellular access from big, expensive places, and they bundle it together in a way that they save you a ton of money. If you're still using one of the big wireless providers, I'll give you a hint. They're the ones that are buying each other at the top of the food chain. Do you wonder what you're paying for? Because I often do. I know exactly what I'm paying for with my particular wireless provider, a grandfathered-in plan with enough data to move the Titanic each and every month. But look, when you're looking at the big wireless providers, you're paying for expensive retail stores. You're paying for hidden fees. You're paying for their marketing. You're paying for the fact that they know you'll keep paying because you've been paying for so long, which is where Mint Mobile comes in. They provide the same premium network coverage you're used to, but at a fraction of the cost. Everything they do is online. Everything they do, if you're watching the video, you can see that happy little green fox there. Everything they do is about saving you money. They don't have retail locations. They don't have high overhead. They pass those savings directly to you. If you're looking at a $75 a month phone bill, and I was, and then I was looking at a fair chunk of change because my son got old enough. It was time to get him a cell phone. I was outraged. He was going to do texting and he was going to do some phone calls. He wasn't going to do much of either one, and they were looking for a staggering amount of money. Mint Mobile, right? They make it easy to cut your bill down to just $15 a month. So I was looking at my son's phone, and I'm thinking I can pay like $60 here, or I can pay like $15 there. $15 sounds like a really good deal, right? They have a 3-month introductory plan. Every plan comes with nationwide unlimited talk, unlimited text. You don't have to pay for unlimited data you're not going to use. In the case of my son's phone, there is really no way for him to use data. So you can get plans with 3, 8, or 12 gigabytes of 4G LTE data. You can use your own phone with any Mint Mobile plan. You keep your same phone number along with all your existing contacts. You can ditch your old wireless bill and start saving with Mint Mobile. To get your new wireless plan for just $15 a month with their 3-month introductory plan and get the plan shipped to your door for free, you don't even need to leave the house. Go to mintmobile.com/twitch. That's mintmobile.com/twitch. Cut your wireless bill to $15 a month with their 3-month introductory plan at mintmobile.com/twitch. And we want to thank Mint Mobile for their sponsorship of This Week in Computer Hardware. It's easy. It's so easy to move a phone to Mint. It's nice. I like affordable things. You know what else I like? Getting dust out of my computer.
So you enjoy the process of this, or just not having it?
I enjoy not having it better. But what happens, even if you have filters, the dust gets sucked into the filter and it stays there. Ethermax did something really crazy with the Revolution DF850W. And I want to say Jeremy found this and did a quick write-up of it on PCPro.com. But I was heartbroken by this review, this review on FPSreview.com, because it doesn't seem to include the new DFRTM technology, which is built into this new Ethermax Revolution DF850. Essentially, there's a button, a switch, and if you hit the button, you get dust-free rotation technology activated, which essentially means they reverse the fan. And if you, it's pretty funny. There's a second link up there, Kevin, and if you take a look at that link and scroll down, keep scrolling, it's so much fun. There it is.
Oh, here we go. Look at
the
arrows.
reversing of the airflow graphic. You hit the button. And for like 10 seconds, the idea is that it's going to reverse the airflow and blow all the dust back off of the fan or out of the fan.
Haven't we seen this from GPUs in the past? I want to say maybe it was MSI. There was at least one vendor who had, when you first booted up your system, the fans would run the opposite direction for a few seconds, stop, and then start spinning in the normal direction again to try to get dust out of the GPU. But I'm not sure how effective that really was.
I got to be honest with you. I think it would be more effective to put a filter between this fan, and the outside of the case, rather than relying on reversing the flow to blow the dust out. Because, if you've ever blown the dust out of a power supply, it turns out a lot of that dust is pretty tenacious. So, in any case, the FPS review website said basically performance was excellent as a power supply. And again, I was a little heartbroken that they didn't go deep into an exploration of the actual button dust reversing action.
But well, I mean, that graphic on Intermax's site is so, it takes care of it. I mean, one way that, look at this. There's even a video. If you're watching the video, by the way, we're watching what appears to be a video demo from Intermax themselves, showing the DF switch in action, showing that you indeed do press it down. And then when you depress it, it does change the direction of the air.
The power supply. I'm just saying. In any case, it's out there. It's a decent power supply. It just amused me, the idea that you're going to have a button to reverse the airflow and get rid of the dust. I don't think it's going to work. Other thing it announced this week that kind of got me onto an exploration of SSD costs, SK Hynix. They make memory, right? They make controllers. They've been making SSDs for OEMs for a while. This morning, they actually launched a new series of SSDs on Amazon.com in the United States. So it's a 2.5-inch SATA SSD, 255, 101 terabyte configurations. It's 3D NAND with, of course, an SK Hynix controller. And they're saying that both the NAND and the controller, of course, are made by SK Hynix. $124 for 1 terabyte. That's about $16 more expensive than comparable models from Crucial and Western Digital and SanDisk. I guess you could say Western Digital and SanDisk are kind of the same source, given that Western Digital owns SanDisk. But that's about a 15% price delta. They're a little pricey than compared to what else is out there. Includes a 5-year, 600 TBW total bytes written warranty. And I got kind of fascinated because I started nosing around. To put that into perspective, a pricier $140 Samsung 860 EVO has a similar 5-year warranty, but it covers up to 2,400 terabytes on their terabytes written package. And a $100 1 terabyte Crucial 3D NAND drive also offers 5 years, but 360 terabytes written, or total bytes written, I should say, 360 terabytes of total bytes written guarantee. I put that into perspective. That's 197 gigabytes written per day for 5 years on the Crucial with the 360 terabytes. So when you put that into perspective, you're looking close to 400 gigabytes a day written as a guarantee for that SK Hynix drive, or 2,400 terabytes, which is is 1.6 terabytes per day, something crazy like that for the Samsung. The math, it gets boggling when you start looking at that. But we've been joking about Ryan's Law for a long time, since Ryan was hosting the podcast, which is that idea of the 10 cent per gigabyte SSD. And for basic SSDs, not for NVMe SSDs, it is here in volume. There are tons of $99 to $110 1 terabyte SSDs on Amazon. $200 to $225 will get you a 2 terabyte SSD. So if you want, for example, if you have a server box that you're running your video off of, or if you have your audio hosted, or if you want to get really crazy with a NAS system, and back it up, because I get a little nervous about running SSDs in NAS boxes. But if you want to improve the performance of the thing you serve your music or your video off of, getting one of these SSDs is a way to do it, and you're not going to really worry about wearing it out, because you're just going to be reading information off that drive, which is a little bit less traumatic to the device than writing to it. So SK Hynix Gold launched today. Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, speaking of traumatic, I was while you were talking, I was thinking, the ultimate way to add anxiety to Patrick's life would be to somehow implement a custom liquid-cooled NVMe NAS. Think about it. The added complication of custom liquid cooling, all of your data on M.2 NVMe drives inside of a small enclosure.
Yeah, that doesn't make me nervous at all.
But what if we added a reverse fan to remove dust? Think about it. I could put this together into one completely not manufacturable product that no one would ever buy.
Well, you could build it in small cases and charge incredible amounts for it. Perhaps as an Etsy product.
True. Oh, see, this is what crowdfunding is for. We'll have to test the waters and then find an OEM crazy enough to even promise to build this for me.
I have some friends that recently did Indiegogo for a product launch who are sitting quietly assembling gaming headsets in a warehouse in Illinois right now. You might want to talk to them about that before you get involved in committing yourself to assembling lots and lots of widgets. Other light news, I don't know if you don't remember Amplify, which is a consumer branch of Ubiquiti that makes an actually very solid router. Robert Heron deployed one at his mom's house. He runs one at his house. It was my first mesh network in my house. Really, really well thought out remote administration, especially. They actually added a free teleport app, which you can download for Google Play, iOS, and Android TV. So if you want to run a VPN and you have an Amplify system in your network, it's a pretty slick way of doing it. So I was kind of impressed by that. That's going to be a free addition. So essentially it'll allow you to VPN to your home network if you're worried about using the network on the road and you have an Amplify system. Hey, one last story before we go. FAA bans recalled MacBook Pros from flights. This was, I was kind of fascinated by this. Bloomberg did a nice write-up on this. The FAA sent airlines a reminder, quote, to follow 2016 safety instructions that ban goods with recalled batteries, like recently recalled MacBook Pros from the planes. This is essentially a bunch of 2015 MacBook Pros that Apple, quote, determined that in a limited number of older generation 15-inch MacBook Pro units, the battery may overheat and pose a fire safety risk. We were talking about this before, and for some reason I was thinking about water and battery fires because of a friend that owns a Tesla. But I would like to remind everybody that metal fires, which is a lithium-ion battery fire, is if memory serves a Class D fire. There it is. If a fire is, Battery University has a great article on this. If a fire occurs in an airplane cabin, the FAA instructs flight attendants to use water or soda pop. Water-based products are most readily available and are appropriate since lithium-ion contains very little lithium metal that reacts with water, in which case it would create a hydrogen gas. Water also cools the adjacent area and prevents the fire from spreading. Research laboratories and factories also use water to extinguish lithium-ion battery fires. So that's kind of fascinating. It's also interesting that Battery University says do not use a Class D fire extinguisher to put out other types of fires. Make certain regular extinguishers are also available. So if you're particularly worried about battery fires in your home, you should have a Class D extinguisher, but don't use the Class D extinguisher for non-metal based fires. And that gets into a certain level of preparedness that even I am not entirely ready for. Oh, my goodness. Hey, we're actually enjoying getting the questions you guys are sending us. Twitch, TWICH. No, Twitch, TWICH. The Twitch with a T has an office in San Francisco, and they're not going to answer your questions. Twitch at TwitchTV is the place to email them. We got a question from Bernard coming next week. We would also like to have your question on there. So do us a favor, email Twitch at twit.tv or tweet at Patrick Norton or at Sebastian Peak on Twitter. Right now, you're looking at a website, if you're watching the video of This Week in Computer Hardware. twit.tv/Twitch is the website with information on how to subscribe on all the things, no matter what platform you want to watch or listen on, or just search for This Week in Computer Hardware, and you'll probably find us. And I got to say thank you to each and every one of you for listening, and thank you for listening each and every week. And if you haven't subscribed, go ahead and do it. Search for Twitch or This Week in Computer Hardware on your favorite podcatcher, or go to twit.tv/Twitch. For more Sebastian Peak, head to PCPro.com. For more of me, check out AVXL next week. And seriously, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for listening. And with that, I'm Patrick Norton.
And I am Sebastian Peak.
We'll catch you next week on Twitch.